Welcome everybody to the Lorina Stephens World Tour. I think we're calling it now. The second installment of we don't know how many. This is a huge success. Maybe we'll just keep going. Hey, Lorina? Once a week.
Yeah, we'll go on the World Book Tour.
Why not? Why not? So this is lightly structured, but informal. But I am going to go through a few elements, introductions, and whatnot. And we'll do a little Q&A, and if we're lucky, maybe Lorina will grace us with some readings. So we'll see how it goes. And people feel free to speak up anytime. You don't have to sit back and be quiet. This is not just a spectator event; it's a participatory event. So I think most of you know me, Joe Mahoney. I had the good fortune of having my debut novel published by Lorina and Five Rivers Publishing, which was a seminal event in my life. It's been a fantastic experience. Happy to pay that back a little bit. But I am absolutely not the important person here, and we'll get to the important person. But first, you also know Graham. But just for the purposes of the recording, and just in the off chance that in the last few days somebody's forgotten who Graham is, Richard Graham Cameron, editor and publisher of the Aurora Award-winning Canadian SF fiction magazine Polar Borealis. Also a columnist for Amazing Stories magazine. And as I described him the last time we did this, and I think it's worth repeating, is I consider him a unifying figure in Canadian science fiction. He's bringing a whole bunch of people together, people that I have known for many, many years virtually, and only just now am seeing when I am able to pop into one of his events or something like this. So, and of course with Polar Borealis as well. And one day I'll actually be able to say the name of the magazine without completely mucking it up. And I'd like to invite Graham to say a few words, if you'd care to, about Lorina.
Well, of course my retirement shtick is promoting Canadian writers, and Lorina is a particularly good writer. I'm more than happy to provide this meeting for her book launch. And in fact, for Canadian science fiction and speculative writers in general, but on this occasion, I'm particularly happy to provide it for Lorina, who I think is a terrific writer. And this is her moment, so I will now be quiet.
All right. Thank you for that. And just in the comments, every now and then I'm posting the odd link to the sorts of things that we're talking about. So I posted the link to Graham's magazine, and you can check out Lorina's website if you haven't already. And of course, Lorina, our guest of honor today, the author of Dreams of the Moon, the book we've come together to celebrate. Lorina has worked as an editor, freelance journalist for national and regional print media, and she's the author of 10 books, putting people like me completely to shame. Already mentioned that she published my book, and she's also written several short fiction pieces published in well-regarded venues such as the aforementioned Polar Borealis, on Spec, Neo-opsis, and Marion Zimmer Bradley's fantasy anthology Sword Sorceress X. X10. Yes. You know what, Graham? I think I will volunteer to edit this afterwards. I think I want that power. Lorina lives with her husband of 47 years, Gary, in an historic Stonehouse in Neustadt, Ontario. Did I pronounce it correctly this time, Lorina? Neustadt?
Yep.
Okay, good. Which I think is just, that house I think is just as amazing an accomplishment as anything that you've written. And I hope to get to see it one day. So, Lorina, what do you have to say for yourself? Tell us a little bit about about your short story collection, Dreams of the Moon.
Well, I suppose Dreams of the Moon came about simply because, we get bored during COVID times. And I found myself after elder care, because we went through that last year, and I had to shut down the publishing house and return rights to all the authors. I found myself sort of, at loose ends, and well, I get my life back now, and what am I going to do with it? And oh yeah, gee, I was a writer. So I decided to put together my second collection of short stories, and that's what happened, Dreams of the Moon. It's I can never say the word, eponymous. Help me out, guys.
Eponymous, I think, yeah.
Eponymous, yes. It's eponymous named for the the main story, the first story, Dreams of the Moon. Yeah, and I just thought it was a good time to put together a new collection of stories, see what people thought, and go from there. It gave me a great break from writing my current novel in progress, which is a historical fiction based on the first Norse settlement in North America at Lanceau Meadows, Newfoundland. And that's a work that's deeply mired in a whole lot of research. And I said previously that I have to get that research right, because someone I know is going to come along and say, oh, Lorina, you didn't get that material culture right. So yeah, it's probably the most ambitious work I've ever taken on. So Dreams of the Moon gave me a great break from that. And I also decided to resurrect an old science fiction novel that I had mentioned to Robert some years ago called Brogan's Folly. And he had said, Lorina, why don't you resurrect that? And so I'm heeding your advice, Robert, and I'm resurrecting that. But Dreams of the Moon ended up being the easier course. It was easy to put together all those other short stories that I had written. And as with anything I do, it sort of has a tendency to be a bit ad hoc. Why go forward with a plan? Yeah, the stories aren't connected by way of theme or anything. What does connect them is a study of people put into extraordinary situations, sometimes dealing with grief or danger or absurd situations. And then I decided that I would organize them from dark to light, kind of following along the path that I did with my first collection, which was And the Angels Sang. And dark to light because I like to leave people with a note of hope. So to me, that's kind of a journey of life, that sometimes we go through struggles. And I like what Graham had said, I don't know, a week or two ago, where there's Murphy's Law and then there's Graham's Law. So Murphy's Law says anything that can go wrong will go wrong. But Graham's Law says anything that can go wrong will go wrong, but in the end, it'll be okay. I subscribe to Graham's Law. In the end, it will be okay. So that's why I end the collection on a lighter note, because yeah, that's true. In the end, it will probably be okay if we're willing to make it okay. And that concept of traveling from dark to light, to me, also reflects the phases of the moon, the darkness of the moon to the full moon, and all of those things. And in the full moon, well, there's all kinds of urban myths about how people get a little crazy in a full moon, and I have a tendency to like absurd humor. So when I do write something light, it has a tendency to be in that category. What if someone suddenly should meet at their fridge in the middle of the night, oh, a bear drinking Coke. What do you do then? And so one of the stories is about that, bear at the fridge. Yeah, so it works from, like I said, that darkness to light. And that's what the collection is about in a long rambling way.
Perfect. I am posting a couple of links to where people can purchase it, either while we're talking here tonight or anytime. And in a few moments, I'm going to ask you several more questions, and I'd like to invite others here to think of any questions they might have, which you can put in the comments, which of course Lorina can see as well as any of us, and can choose to answer them. But before we get to that, I'd like to ask Lorina if you would grace us with an excerpt, or perhaps even an entire story.
I'm looking for advice here. I'm not really sure whether to start with the title story, Dreams of the Moon, which is quite dark and which I read at the premiere of this
of the world tour.
Yeah. Or if I should move on to something new. Joe, do you have any suggestions for me, or anyone else? No? Yes?
Well, let's have a thumbs up. Who wants to hear the eponymous story?
Yeah, one.
I think
Personally, I would like to hear something light.
Light. Then
Kind
we'll
of
do.
rainy here.
Well, let's read A Bear at the Fridge, which was first published in Polar Borealis. It was issue 6.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Perhaps the real question was whether she should just cut any attempt at logic and go directly to a nervous breakdown. Maybe she should start shouting into the middle of this weird night, or to claim the existence of spirits and guides. And what the hell was this bear, a grizzly no less, doing slurping Coke from her fridge, standing up slurping Coke from her fridge, smiling no less, even offering some pretty interesting conversation, were she honest, around prodigious belching. By now, Ralph, that was his name, so he insisted, was on his 6th Coke, which was reasonable, she supposed, when she thought about it. He was, after all, a prodigious great beast of a bear, so 6 cans of brown fizz didn't seem so extreme. Extreme? She was thinking about the ramifications and quantification of extreme when there was this. She grabbed the tea towel hanging from the stove and held it up against herself, realized that wee pocket handkerchief of a tea towel wasn't going to do anything to cover boobs and crotch, and then wondered why she bothered, because the bear, Ralph, wouldn't be concerned she was standing there gawping like some great beached fish, naked as new. She hung a towel over her shoulder. Seemed like a good thing to do. Behind Ralph, the microwave displayed 3:31 in cool blue light of the bloody AM. Maybe I'm hallucinating, dreaming. Maybe I'm really still in bed. So the thing is, Ralph said, I'm getting kind of tired chatting you around in your dreams, so I figured I'd wake you up. He shook that mammoth head, and she wondered if that growl was laughter or something that meant she should turn around and make for the back door, which was closest, instead of standing there in the dimness of her kitchen, the glow of the open fridge door spilling out like a Colville painting across the tiles. Maybe she should run screaming into the night. What would Alice and Petra think if she showed up at their front door at this hour? Naked? Burbling about bears? Well, one bear to be exact, drinking soft drinks in her kitchen. Batshit crazy is what they'd think. Wonder if she spent too much time up in the woods alone chasing spirit guides. Or maybe was growing some hot stuff in her barn. And then she thought, but there aren't any grizzlies here. Not in Ontario. That was for sure. Certainly not up on the Bruce. Black bear, sure. And no bloody grizzlies discussing climate change in front of your fridge door. Well, dreamer no, what did this bear, this Ralph, want with her, chasing her around in her dreams? Had she been dreaming of bears, of grizzlies, and coke? Seriously? But then as she watched him leaning on the fridge door, she did remember vague images of bears, or a bear to be precise, a bear trying really hard to squeeze into the palm of her hand, just the way a spirit guide might. She looked at her left hand, turned it palm up, felt it itching, looked back up at Ralph. Why was it so easy to call him that? And wondered how some talking earth sign could shrink enough to fit into her hand, or, for that matter, how he could pass through skin and bone and muscle and stuff and get inside her. She shuddered. Ralph shook his head and whoofed again, his jaw waggling. She was sure that was laughter. Well, this was absurd. She backed away, out onto the porch, grabbed the throw on the old rocker and threw it around her shoulders. She thought maybe she should sit down. Her knees were by now yelling at her to do that, to bend over, to swim out of the grayness, buzzing at the edge of her sight. But instead, she leaned back, felt the hard spindles against her head, the cool zephyr coming down off the hills. Cricket song, the night, the sanity of this place. And woke to sunlight, fragile and perfect, the dawn chorus in the woods. There had been a bear called Ralph, guzzling coke in her kitchen. She laughed then, laughed at herself and the absurdity of waking dreams, of chasing spirits and guides, rose up and let the throw drop back to the rocker, opened the screen door into the kitchen and halted. There were empty cans all over the floor. Did I do this? Very likely. That could be the only rational explanation. She bent and gathered up the cans, tossed them into the recycling bin, checked the fridge, and decided a trip into Lion's Head was what was required. A shower first, then breakfast in the village, scoop up some groceries, and head back. She needed to get out more, needed to get outside of her head. That's what was needed. Later, when she stood in the checkout, watching supplies being deposited into her bags, Alice, who was punching at the cash register, had just extended an invitation to come and have supper with her and Petra. Ralph will be there too, she said. Ralph? Her heart kicked. She scratched the palm of her left hand, looked down at the red blotch there, a very bear-shaped blotch. Ralph? Alice laughed and nodded to the man standing in the line behind her. Bearded, mountain man bearded, sort of honey brown, bearded, dark eyes under winged eyebrows, and he whoofed a laugh. Ralph, she said, her mouth felt dry. He winked. Got under your skin already, I see. She looked back down at her palm, up at him. You? Pretty much. Hey, whoever said spirit guides were easy. There you go.
Thank you. So perhaps you'll grace us with another one later. So think about that. Maybe as your collection goes from dark to light, today you'll go from light to dark.
Perhaps.
We'll see. So to start in on some questions, and again, anybody can chip in with questions, but I'll just get the ball rolling. So Ralph, you chose the name Ralph for this story. I was curious.
Ralph. It's Ralph.
How do you spell it?
Ralph. Ralph.
Okay, right. That's what I thought. Yeah. How do you choose the names for your characters in all your work?
Oh, well, it depends on the story. Usually when I'm writing a novel, the names have to have a meaning. So I actually go and research the deep meaning of a name so that it will have mana. And I know that makes it sound like I'm totally nuts, but it matters to me. Sometimes for a short story, it more has to do with the sound it makes. I'm always conscious of the words I choose, and that includes names. So Ralph, it's kind of a round, woofing, a Ralph, what a dog does. Ralph, Ralph, Ralph. Or perhaps a bear, Ralph, Ralph, Ralph. Okay, so it's a bear's name, Ralph. Made sense to me.
That works. Absolutely. So I'm asking different questions today than I asked last time. Just for the sake of the people who were at our last session. Do you hide anything in your work, in your stories, that people who knew you well would recognize?
Yeah, very definitely. I very much am a believer in we write what we know. And I say that because if you're going to write anything that has any gravitas, I choose a different term, mana to it, you have to bring yourself to the table. And I believe you have to be willing to be vulnerable, to dig deep and let it out. In a way, writing can be the very best therapy that you can ever not pay for. Although in some ways you do pay for it. But anyway, yeah, and sometimes I get uncomfortable about the fact that I have allowed myself to be quite transparent, to be a window, because I am essentially a very private person, believe it or not. So to expose that much of yourself on paper, well, that's a metaphorical term, it sometimes can be a little disconcerting and uncomfortable. And yeah, briefly it goes through my head, oh, are people going to think that, she did this or she experienced that or whatever? And in some cases, they're going to be right to think that. In other cases, it's more an empathy that you can transport yourself, project yourself into someone else's life and someone else's thoughts. And you bring some of your own experience with you, of course, because that's your window on the universe. You bring yourself into that as well, and you project what it is that person might feel. But you can only do that if you're willing to dig deep into yourself. The bear at the fridge, okay? Well, yeah, part of that is me, not a bear. But
Yeah.
I've had some weird lucid dreams, and I'm not going to go into the details of them because they are truly weird, and I want you all to leave here believing that I really am sane. But yeah, some very strange dreams and things that have happened, and perhaps waking hallucinations, if you will. And it does cause you to question reality. So the way that I deal with some of those things is to write about them. And maybe it's not so much even dealing with those things, but they get stored into the mental filing cabinet to bring out later when I might need them. Yeah, it's very interesting, Joe, that you should ask that question tonight of all nights, because I went earlier when Graham was talking about his university experience and how wonderful it was, et cetera, and that's great. I was thinking of what one English teacher had said to me. We had been assigned it was a poetry assignment amongst others in that semester, and the poetry assignment was to come up with 100 poems in a collection. Well, that's a pretty steep order, but I did it. And they were very heartfelt poems. I mean, I'm not a poet. It's not what I do. Nonetheless, handed it in, and she failed me on it. Fair enough. And her comment was, you shouldn't expose so much of yourself on paper. And it was that comment that has carried forward with me through all my adult life. That what is literature of any form, unless we're willing to expose ourselves? because you're the writer. All you have is this window, this experience to put out there onto paper. And I think if you try to write something other than your familiarity with life, then it's not going to ring quite true. And I'm sure there's lots of people who would disagree with me, and that's fine because art is subjective and there are many paths to art. But for me, that rings true.
Hmm.
Yeah. So it's a
Wow.
scary place to be.
Yeah, but perhaps there's some strength in vulnerability and giving strength to other people reading it once they
Yeah.
see your vulnerability. What kind of a balance do you strike between placating to the reader, entertaining the reader, versus making demands of the reader?
I'm going to sound like a really arrogant twat. I don't strike a balance. I don't. I write for myself, and that's a whole lot of hubris going on there, I know. But that's not why I pursue any art form. I write for myself. If someone else comes along and enjoys that, who is willing to come and sit at my window on the universe, then that's great. Here, pull up a chair like the friendly giant. Here's a chair for you, and let's share this. But I'm not going to write ever for anyone else's what's the word I'm looking for? Not pleasure. That's not what I'm looking for. Expectation. That's what I'm looking for.
Hmm.
I write the stories that mean something to me. And then if someone else enjoys them, that's really wonderful because then we've struck a communication. It's just like paintings, because I paint too. I spent about a decade, and Adam, my son, who's sitting here now, hi Adam, he can attest to this. I spent about a decade painting paintings that I hated, and I painted them. There's a line in The Rose Guardian, my recent novel, when she says she paints pretty pictures for tourists. That's exactly what I did. And while Gary and Adam and our daughter were in the kitchen preserving harvest, I'd be sitting there or standing at my desk, and I'd be painting all of these really stupid flower cards. They were flower cards, but they were very detailed watercolors of lady slippers and orchids of other kinds, and yeah. And I set up an assembly line, and it was just production work. And I produced 20, 50 cards depending in a week, and I'd take them to the farmer's market. I sold them for $10 a pop. And through the recession, that really helped out with groceries and stuff. But it was a job. It was something I had to do. And after we got out of the recession and I stopped having to sell at the farmer's market, I stopped painting for about 15 years. That just sucked the soul out of everything that I wanted to paint. And I don't ever want that to happen to my writing. I did that with journalism. That's a different form. But for many years, I wrote a column for our local paper that was called Lorina's People. And I would go and interview locals, just folks, just people. Maybe this person was a beekeeper, or maybe this person was an artist, or maybe this person was actually, I interviewed the first nurse who developed the palliative care program in Ontario. That was enlightening. So yeah, but they were a hard slog because you interview a person, and like if you're any good at what you do as an interviewer, you just let the conversation go. I'd set up the recorder and we just let the conversation go. Felt great, but now you come home and you've got 2 hours worth of tape that you've got to transcribe, and then out of that transcription, you've got to build an article that can't fill up any more than about 15 to 20 column inches. That's a hard slog. So Yeah, don't want to do that with the art that matters to me a lot. So my novels, my short stories, I write them for me, nobody else. And if you like them, great. But if you don't, that's fine too. So, long answer.
That takes me in a number of different directions. I know I must choose one, although I may ask them all. But first, I just want to remind people, if anybody else has a question, just look at the bottom of your screen. You'll see the chat thing there. Forgive me if I'm stating the obvious, but you can just throw your question into the chat, and then we will add the question. So you said that you just write for yourself. You don't make demands of the reader. What demands do you make of yourself as you're writing?
Yeah, that's a good one. To write the truth as I know it. Everybody knows I say art is subjective, and I'm going to sound like a not a very good person, but truth is subjective too. Everybody has a truth, and this person's truth may be different than another person's truth. It's all about perspective. So for me, it's about writing the truth, and the truth encompasses, if there are historical aspects or material culture aspects in the piece, I have to make sure that that's right, that I've done my research well. Truth in characters. Are these characters believable? Are they real people? And that's where I have to go down deep into myself in order to be able to give people justification for their actions and that sort of thing. Yeah, does that answer your question at all?
It does, and it unfortunately it segues into another question I had out of your last answer. So thank you for doing that. And I think I suspect the answer based on what you said, but I just want to know for sure. So when writing, does it energize you or does it exhaust you?
Both. Yeah. When I'm writing, I actually have and painting too, any creative process. I actually have a physical reaction, and you'll notice tonight I'm flushed. But that happens when I'm writing and when I'm painting. I get flushed, I get excited. And my mind just starts going off like a whole lot of firecrackers everywhere. And it's sometimes difficult to rein that in. And consequently, because of that huge, both physical and mental energy expenditure, at the end of a session, I am exhausted and blotto. Gary will find me and he'll ask me something, and I am incapable of any kind of an intelligent conversation for perhaps a few hours. Yeah, I'm off in La La Land. Yeah.
And I see that Mireille has asked a question, so we'll throw it to her. Do you find that you begin with the situation or with the character usually?
I'm going to have to say none of those usually. Yeah, it depends on a piece, okay? For instance, Mireille, I think that you got the novel From Mountains of Ice, yeah? The genesis of that story started with the concept of a reluctant hero. But more than that, it was someone who is a senior. And how is this person going to then deal with an impossible situation that he has to face? That was the whole premise of the story. It took me a long time to find a way to find something to hang from that hook. But that's how that one started. When I wrote Shadow Song, that one started because of an interview that I did with a woman who had an antique store, and I interviewed her, and she took me back to their historic home, which was an original log cabin. It was a settler's cabin in the village of Hornings Mills. And that cabin and some of the historical artifacts that were in a time capsule that they found buried in a wall, that became genesis for Shadow Song. And in that time capsule, there was an empty tea tin, there was an empty lavender bottle, there was a desiccated tobacco plug, there was something else that I cannot remember, and a note that said, take me a minute to remember, to whoever finds these, to whoever finds these, know that I have experienced love and given love. And it was signed Danielle Michelle Fleming. Well, Danielle Michelle Fleming is the heroine in that story, Shadow Song. And those artifacts become a part of that story. And yeah, that was the genesis of that. The one I'm working on now, Cathy's Lament, that's the story about the first Norse settlement in North America at Lancel Meadows. The genesis for that story had nothing to do with Vikings, had nothing to do with Lancel Meadows. It had to do with the concept of buffeting wind. How the hell do you make a story out of wind? Well, apparently I am. And the wind will form, already is forming, a character unto itself. Just in the way, for instance, that Hardy had used the Moors as this slow sleeping behemoth that ruled the destinies of the people who lived upon the Moors. For me, in this story, it's the wind that will be almost a malevolent force that buffets these people around between destinies and relationships and impossible situations. So that was the genesis of that story. So it doesn't necessarily start with the character, and it doesn't necessarily start with the situation. It's just something, I don't know, that becomes a trigger, and enough of a trigger that I'm going to build something. That answered the question, sort of, kind of.
Now, Peter says that that I'm asking the big questions, and he'd like to ask a small one. And I will get to his question, which isn't necessarily small. I just want to ask one more big one first. Yesterday, a friend of mine from high school called me up, and he's written a book, and he tells me with great confidence that it's going to be a huge bestseller. And so I tried not to, rain on his parade. But I suspect that he might find success in a different way than what he might expect. So I want to ask you, what does success as a writer mean to you?
I don't know, Joe. After all these years, all these decades, I still, I won't say battle, but I struggle with that concept. Because we live in this Western society where success equates money. And, that's drilled into you from childhood, yeah? So in that regard, I consider myself a colossal failure. But what I do find the most gratification in is to come upon a review that I might find, say, on Goodreads or oh gee, oh look at that, there's a review on Amazon or whatever, and they've given it a 4 or a 5-star rating, and they've really talked about the piece. It's not just, oh, this was really good. That kind of a review sucks. But they get into why it is the novel or the collection spoke to them. Wow, hey, you can't bank that. That's absolutely gold. And in that regard, I consider myself very, very fortunate, maybe even success. Because despite the fact that, yeah, I've been colossally panned by some reviewers and some readers, who hasn't? But when I go through and I start reading the reviews from people who did get what I was writing about, and it's so gratifying to see that you connected with them, that somehow experiences that you wrote about in that piece connected with them. There was and even more gratifying was a review that I'd had about my recent novel, The Rose Guardian, where they found that it had really helped them deal with the grief of their mother departing. So that's something, like I said, you can't bank that.
And is not having friends and respected colleagues present tonight a form of success and validation?
That is just so gratifying, and yeah.
All right, now to Peter's question. Would you please expound on the connection between your left palm and the spirit animal?
Well, that goes back to what I understand is an Anishinaabe belief that a spirit guide will enter through your left hand, and it has to be the palm, and they come up to your heart, yeah, and then if you should be unlucky enough, the spirit guide leaves you, it exits through the right. So that's all that comes from. Fair enough? You're welcome.
Okay. At this point, I think I would like to ask if you would grace us with another excerpt.
Sure. Let's see here. Well, this one's not quite so somber, so Peter won't be too upset. Yeah. It's called Gravity, and it makes its first appearance in this collection. She can hear the screech owl again, a soft tenor tremolo in the trees. It's dusk, a time of violet light when even the air stills. Her heart stills. It has been thumping, silent to all but her, the way an owl's wings beat unheard by prey. In this suspended moment, she wonders if she falls like an owl from her perch, will she be able to effortlessly push away the air once, twice, rise in disdain of gravity, and glide across the meadow to that far line of maples and spruce, and find the gnarled ancient beech that spreads limbs over the spring, and rest, and watch. There, the spring that flows ceaselessly, deceptively, warm to invited skin even in the bitterest of winters. Will she see that face again? Will those fingers rise as liquid cascades like skin shedding? Will she be able to conquer her fear this time? Will she? Her tea is ready, long since ready. Some minutes ago, the machine finished sputtering hot water into her mug. She turns away from the window, lifts the cup from the platform on the beverage maker, spoons out the tea bag, and splashes milk. She watches clouds billow up, form and reform. She thinks of Cathy. She thinks of her mercurial nature, remembers her laughter. It seemed to consume her whole body, the smile that spread across her face and defied anyone not to laugh with her. The clouds in her cup become beige and disappear, the way Cathy's smile did, the way the light in her eyes died long before she. There were things she could see even in their virtual visits. Cathy, who had hung on the edge of a black star, studying, watching, analyzing data until it became apparent analysis had slipped into a place as bizarre as the thing she studied. There are voices here, Mom. There are no voices. You wouldn't know. You're not here. No, she wasn't there. The tea is tepid when finally she sips it. She tastes salt, swipes angrily at her cheeks. Ridiculously, she thinks she should put on her rubber boots, throw on her coat, and shuffle her way out to the spring. It's insane for her to even contemplate doing that. 2 canes to guide an arthritic cripple over muddy April terrain isn't exactly the smartest thing to do. But, she reasons, there are perching places along the way, built long ago by Robert before Cathy died, before he died, before it all fell apart. And who the hell did she have to answer to now? No one, really. There were friends who would admonish, a son halfway across the world who visited via virtual once a week. But here, now, there's only her, both a freedom and a prison. And now Cathy had come home, a sealed cylinder of ash, a relic slipping through time, space, a promise to keep. She looks over at her work table, where the automaton remains unfinished, a grandiose toy for a child long gone, something from a past no longer within reach. She'd gone to the trouble to niello the silver of the wings, to articulate each feather so that when the cams and gears went through their clockwork precision, it would seem the owl fluffed and preened silently, which was a trick in itself. The answer was in the serrated primary feathers of the wings. Microturbulence, smaller currents, silence. And she'd even managed to create lift so that the owl would actually fly. No engine, no electronic control, just the art of the clockmaker and the toy maker. Someone who knew enough about physics and art to create an articulated toy, an homage to Pierre Jaget Dros, a gift for a child, her child, long gone. She succumbs to the comfort of her bench and work familiar to her hands. Her hands ache now, and she tries to push through the pain, fitting another flexible silvery feather into the grid. Under the lens, the grid and the feather's pivot are monstrous. She blinks dry eyes, feels a scratch of her lids, and knows she should stop, should rest. It's getting late. The owl calls again. She thinks she should retrofit a sound box for this automaton. But for what purpose? Who was there to hear it now, to coo and gawk over the wonder of a mechanical toy? The wire slips into place around the eye under the quill of the feather. She reaches with the long-nosed tweezers and pulls gently on the filament of wire, watches the feather lift, pivot, lets go, and picks up another of the fragile, thin slivers of silver. She runs her finger over the edge, testing for ragged edges, cries out, and sucks on the blood that wells. That was a stupid thing to do, she thinks, and buffs the offending burr with a fine grit pad. Children could hurt themselves on shoddy workmanship like that. What children? There would be no more children to explore this toy, this elaborate toy more suited to a collector than a child. What had she been thinking all those years ago? She'd been thinking of laughter, of a way to coax laughter from that sullen, brooding daughter of hers, something of wonder to lift her from depression, maybe cause a spark of curiosity so that she'd want to investigate the real world inspiration behind this automaton. A promise of freedom, a promise of a flight of imagination. But no, instead, a relic, a beautiful ornament collecting dust on a shelf high and beyond interest until it became a weapon. What have you done? And a labor of love, then wreckage on the floor. I knew it would hurt you. And it had, and remained to hurt. Too much to think about, too much time gone. She rises from the table, presses on the oozing cut, and shuffles to the porch where she drapes a shawl around her shoulders and eases onto the swing. The screech owl calls again, that low, warbling sound that casts such a pall of sadness into the dimming light. There is no other bird song now, no requiem to the day. They are afraid. There is an owl awake and soon on the hunt, an owl looking out for the fledglings, which are assuredly in the tree line. She knows that call, and once again she wishes she could fly like those silent gray specters. With her toes, she pushes against the porch deck, sets the swing into motion, pushes again, watches the light fade, listens to the owl, thinking of Cathy, thinking of Robert, of the automaton in silver and yellow feathers. She should have been more careful. Feathers can cut. Push. Too many feathers like that and the wings could cut. Push. A beak as sharp as honed steel. Push. Talons like perfect scimitars. And the freedom of flight. To rise. There is pain in her foot, pain in her hip, pain throbbing in fingers, abused this day with too much fine work. That feather, the cut. She tastes metal in her mouth, looks at her finger, sees the bristling of a sliver in the cut, pulls at it in the almost non-existent light, going by touch more than sight. A flare of pain. She pulls at the nub of the sliver, cries out, finds an entire silver feather embedded in her finger. In horror, she shakes her hand. Silver feathers spill from her fingertips. She brushes at them, finds feathers up her arms, feels her shoulders hunch and thicken, her legs shorten. Suddenly the world takes on clarity. Things are so defined. She raises her arms against fear, towards wonder, hears rustling in the grass, whispers in the woods. Before she thinks she's on the grass and beating, her arms become wings against the prison of the earth, rising, such silence. Turns her head, sees the screech owl in the bowl of the old beach, banks, turns. Flight. This is flight. And she dives into the trees, swooping through branches, relishing the speed, the rush of wind over feathers. Freedom, freedom from pain, freedom to move, freedom to leave the past and all its heartache behind. Cathy crushed on the edge of a gravitational singularity. Her ashes slipped through the continuum, back to earth, back to her mother, who outlived a daughter, sliding through space. How did it come to that? She pushes her wings down against gravity. Gravity the enemy, gravity the magnificent wonder, and finds her foot on the floor of the porch. The screech owl descends from the cover of the beach and slides over the meadow. In a moment, a small parliament follow. So not metamorphosis, just dream, and the imperative prison of the earth and memory, and pain in her body, in her heart. She rises and returns to her workbench, lifts another feather, and affixes the delicate wire to the automaton.
Wow, very nice. Gee, a lot of feeling in that story. Was it a healing story?
Yeah, definitely a healing story. Yeah. I won't go into the details of it, but yeah, it was definitely a healing story. Yeah.
And
And
sorry, go on.
it actually started, the inspiration for that lay in a wander that I had one day. I don't know how I got there, of that toy maker of who made these marvelous automatons, and seeing some of that incredible work and wondering, wow, how was that done? So that was the kernel of that, and then the other part of that came from a spring that's actually near us, in the Saugeen Conservation Area. And it is a hot spring, which is so unusual in Ontario. It stays at a constant temperature all year long. So even in the dead of winter, it's flowing and it's stinky, smelly sulfur. And amazing. It's just an amazing thing that it keeps flowing when all around everything's frozen. Yeah. So, inspiration. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I am
Uh,
going to.
oh, Steve's gone.
Yeah, a
Cathy
couple
was
of
on the train
comments.
too. Yes, Cathy is a recurring character for me. Yes.
I'm sharing a review that Graham wrote
Oh, yeah.
of your collection, which I think everybody should check out. A great review. Graham does a great job of reviewing the fiction written by many of us, and I think he does justice to your collection, and I look forward to checking it out. And I think we're just about out of time. I'd like to open it up to everyone. If anybody else has any questions that they'd like to ask verbally, or any comments, or
Mm.
I'd like to see Robert's beard again.
Well,
I don't know.
Yeah, I'd like to see Robert here. There he is.
that's
Lorina,
correct.
are you continuing to write short stories
Yeah.
in addition to your other works?
Yes, absolutely. Yep, I'm working on one right now. That's about a neurologist. I think I've mentioned this before. So I've decided now on a setting. He's going to be in Windsor Castle because apparently there are a huge number of clocks in Windsor Castle. Oh, okay, Marcel. Yeah. Thank you for stopping in. Anyway, the concept for me was one of here's a person who's responsible for clock and for time. So, Time Lord, and, you go down that idea path. But I thought it'd be really interesting to sort of write a short story that is structured like a novel. So there are chapters, segments. And I've decided that the opening line to each section is going to be morning, mum, as in ma'am, as in your majesty. And then he will turn to the clock and wind it. And there will be a very brief description, all from character perspective, of what the room is like. But as he's traveling from room to room, he's traveling through time. So he really is a timekeeper. So how I'm going to pull that off, I'm not entirely sure yet. But it'll be a wonderful adventure in different kinds of timepieces, which will be fascinating for me. I don't know about anybody else. And that's all well and good to have a story about going from room to room to room, but then what is the point of that story? I haven't got there yet, but I will.
And there's a question from Mire. Are your characters growing older like we are?
Yeah, definitely. And actually, I've always written mostly older characters. I have a bit of an antipathy towards the young virile characters, always have had. And everybody's beautiful and everybody's perfect. I don't like that. I like real people. And yes, my character's definitely growing older like we are. From Mountains of Ice, Silvio, the main character in it, he's definitely senior citizen. And I was projecting forward because at the time that I wrote that, I wasn't yet a senior citizen. Yeah. And besides which, I think they make, for the most part, more interesting characters because there's all that life experience, that baggage that we accumulate. Except if you're a very little kid. And if you're a very little kid, there's another whole world that calls you, that you escape into. And I wrote the little kid in The Rose Garden, and that's the Letty story that carries throughout the three women's stories in that novel. So yeah, mostly all older people because of the baggage they carry.
And Wayne has a question.
Oh.
Does it just focus on Queen?
No, and see, that's the point, Wayne. Yeah. The castle and the people who inhabit it are sort of secondary. I sort of want to deal with the the feeling that the people who inhabit a place as old as Windsor Castle, which is from the time of the Norman conquerors, those people leave a mark in those buildings. And yeah, I know that sounds really airy-fairy, and I don't mean it to, but every owner of a place leaves their mark. There is an undeniable presence that's there. I don't mean ghosts, but you know, there's a presence there, and there's all that history there. And I think that's where I want that story to go. So perhaps, you know, the orologist, it isn't just morning, ma'am. Maybe it's whatever it is they call a male version of royalty. But one of, you know, the royals that would have inhabited Windsor Castle. But exactly what it is that takes him through those rooms besides winding clocks, I'm not quite sure, and how that will go. So yeah. And then Jennifer asked, are my characters usually female? It's interesting you should ask that, Jennifer, because someone else asked me that the other day. And it wasn't until I'd been asked that question that I realized that I write a lot of female characters. And actually, Graham, you made that observation when you reviewed this collection. And I guess I do write a lot of female characters. Not always. Certainly in For Mountains of Ice, there's Silvio, who's the main protagonist, but equally, there's his wife, Aletta, who is, you know, kind of pulling in unison there as far as the weight of the story goes. Most of my short stories definitely have a tendency to be more female, although sometimes not. But yeah, I guess because I'm writing what I know, and it's that female perspective. Yeah.
And I think with that, we come to the conclusion of the official program, if I can call it that. So, any parting words before we get Graham to press stop in the record?
Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for your faith. And if you write, just keep writing. If you paint, keep painting. Whatever it is you do, go forward and join. That's all.
Thank you, Lorina.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone else, for coming.
Thank you, Lorina. Joe.
That was lovely.
Thank you.